Somebody going to give me a cue?
He will.
Five, four, three.
From the nether regions of the Bible Belt, this is your Freethought, Northwest Arkansas.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Freethought Northwest Arkansas. I'm your host, Donald Morton, and today we're going to talk about whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. And I've brought some guests along with me. On my right, I have Ian Boyles. Ian, do you accept the historicity of Jesus?
No.
And also on my right, we have Doug Kruger. Do you believe in God?
No, I don't.
Okay. And on my left, we have Charles Brad Braddock. Do you deny the existence of the Holy Spirit?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. And so our topic today, like I said, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Doug has brought some material with him to discuss. What do you have for us?
Well, what I brought today is an examination of some of the main reasons that typically you would find people give when they're trying to convince someone that they should believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And now initially, of course, this sounds like a very improbable story, that someone was dead, and then they were not only dead, they were dead for several days, and then they came back to life as a god, and various other things took place. But just the initial implausibility should be enough to give people some pause. And
Is there any evidence of it besides the Bible?
Well, that's where it gets tricky, because the answer is no. And I don't know how tricky you might think it is, but a number of people will sometimes try to give extra biblical evidence for this. But let me go through what I think are probably 8 typical types of arguments that people give for the resurrection. And the first one is that these gospel accounts in the New Testament are eyewitness accounts that should be sufficient to engage you intellectually, such that you should be convinced that Jesus rose from the dead. So we have, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 Gospels, and they say, well, look, these people say that Jesus rose from the dead. The problem with that is that, first of all, the Gospels were written much later than the time of Jesus. Exactly how much later? Well, some of them at least a half a century later, and so forth. Mark, sometime around 65 to 75 CE. Luke, maybe sometime around 80. Matthew, a little bit later, 85 to 90 CE. And John just gets in the tail end of the first century with about year 100.
And they were pseudonymously written, right? The people that the authors, the supposed authors are not the actual authors, right?
Yes, that's right. The names of the Gospels were given because people were taking some guesses in the 2nd century as to who might have been the authors. But it's very standard for in New Testament scholarship these days for people to simply recognize that these are anonymous works. Now, to many of your viewers here in the Bible Belt in Northwest Arkansas, that's going to sound rather shocking. And people are going to say, well, wait a minute, I can open up my Bible and it says this was written by Mark. But it wasn't written by Mark, or at least not any Mark that knew Jesus. And in fact, now you're thinking, well, why should we take your word for it, Mr. Kruger? All right, why don't we take the word of some of the early writers on the history of Christianity? What we find was that Bishop Eusebius wrote about the person named Papias of Hierapolis, who was the one who named the Gospels. And he says, first of all, that Papias was a person who quote, got his notions by misinterpreting the apostolic accounts, unquote, and he, quote, seems to have been a man of very small intelligence to judge from his books, unquote. That's what Eusebius is saying about Papias. So basically what we find is Eusebius, who's writing in the 4th century, says, a couple of centuries ago, there was this guy named Papias. He was kind of a dummy, and he always got things wrong, and he's the guy who named the Gospels, okay? Now that right there should give you some pause with regard to the credibility here. But how did Papias name these Gospels, right? He's the guy who named them. He said that he had heard, for example, about the Gospel of Mark sometime around 130 or so CE. He said that he heard that there was this guy, Mark, who had been traveling with Peter, and that Mark wrote down all the things that Peter said, but that Mark had never met Jesus. Okay. So right away, one of the earliest accounts we have, and this, by the way, is in the 4th century when Eusebius is writing about Papias, we're told that this early gospel, the earliest one, was not written by an eyewitness. Okay. Now, other questions that we might want to ask are, well, who was it that told Papias in the year 130 or so? Who was it that told him that this was written by Mark? Well, we don't know. Okay. We don't know. Was that person reliable who told him?
Could have been a revelation.
We have no idea. Right.
Direct revelation from God.
Well, yeah, he just said that he heard that, but who he heard it from, we don't know. And also, did he ever hear anything otherwise? Did he ever hear someone say, well, no, that actually was written by Barnabas or someone? No. Okay, so right there, that should give people pause. That's part of the reason that scholars say, well, look, these works were not written by the people whose names are on them, because probably, since there was no research done by Bishop Papias, he probably got it wrong.
And this is over the book of Mark, right?
Over the book of Mark. But the same is true about Matthew, Luke, and John. The same thing. He heard that somebody wrote this one work. He heard that somebody had written another one. So he named the Gospels by hearsay, and there's no good reason to believe that he got these answers correct. But there's good reason to believe that, in fact, he got them wrong. Because, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, there are geographical mistakes. There are errors that if someone had actually lived in that area, they wouldn't be making those kinds of mistakes. So, for example, in Mark 7:31, it says that Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee. But the Sea of Galilee is to the southeast of Tyre, while Sidon is to the north of the city. So as one professor, David Barr, professor of religion at Wright State University, remarked, the itinerary sketched in Mark 7:31 would be like going from New York to Washington, D.C. by way of Boston. Okay, it's just not the kind of route that someone would take.
Now, I thought the Word of God was infallible.
Well, whether it is or not, we don't know because we don't have any. But as far as the Bible is concerned,
Touché.
right. Another geographical mistake in Mark 10:11, Jesus travels from Jericho to Jerusalem via Bethphage and then Bethany. But once again, you find it describes his route, but one of the cities he goes through to get to his destination is further than his destination. So obviously people writing these things were making mistakes. So if these works are anonymous, then we should ask ourselves, what kind of credibility should we afford to these works? Well, given that the initial claim is rather improbable, we should ask ourselves, do we have really good, solid, knockdown evidence that someone 2,000 years ago rose from the dead? And if the answer isn't a resounding yes, absolutely, okay, then we should say, well, I don't think that should be enough to convince me. And for that reason, one of the things that's now happening in 21st century New Testament scholarship, and many of your viewers are probably not aware of this, is that more and more theologians are taking a kind of a fallback position of, well, okay, maybe we can't show that Jesus rose from the dead, but maybe we can reinterpret the resurrection to not be a physical, literal resurrection, but just sort of, that's the way that the apostles interpreted the loss of Jesus, or things like that. That's how they coped with it, and so on.
That's not what Wikipedia says. When I look up Wikipedia, it says born in 5 BC or whatever, died 30 AD, rose from the dead 3 days later.
Well, interestingly, one of the things, at least last time I looked at Wikipedia, that can also be written by anonymous people. So
yeah.
It's not exactly going to lend a great deal of support.
Into the conservative Bible.
Yeah.
Conservapedia.
Conservapedia,
so
right.
I don't have a lot of faith in.
Well, one of the other things that people sometimes say is, well, look, in 1 Corinthians 15, St. Paul says that Jesus appeared to 500 witnesses. Right? So we got 500 witnesses that he rose from the dead, because this was after his crucifixion. And then he appears to 500 people. Well, we can ask ourselves this. How come nobody else seems to know that he appeared to 500 people? How come Paul is the only one who seems to know that? And also, who are these 500 people?
Did they write books or?
Did they write books? How did they know it was Jesus? It's like, look over in the distance, there's a guy in a robe with a beard. Guess it's Jesus, right? Because nobody around here goes like that. That's just his way of rolling, right? So how did they know it was Jesus?
It would have been recorded by the Romans if it was, in fact, an appearance of Jesus.
Well, just that there were 500 people gathered somewhere, you'd think someone else would have noticed. I mean, isn't that the kind of thing that we might expect would have appeared in the Gospels?
And I thought that when the Romans executed people, they wrote it down in a file somewhere.
Well, I'm thinking if 500 people witness the resurrection of a dead body, if I saw that happen right now or on any given day,
You tell somebody.
I would become a believer. Why did those 500 people not immediately set out to spread what they had seen?
Maybe they would have said,
Why-
you're a
why
witch
did it-
and try to kill him.
Well, I mean, but
Right.
It's interesting.
Well,
seeing somebody rise from the dead would be pretty convincing for me.
Well, actually, that's a little bit misleading because, see, they're not actually seeing him rise from the dead. They're seeing some guy walking around. And what we're supposed to believe is that the reason he's walking around is that he rose from the dead. But then again, there have been lots of cases of people who were thought to be dead that weren't. Now, I'm not suggesting that happened in the case of Jesus, because we don't have any reliable account, first of all, that he was really dead or that he was really resurrected. I mean, all we have are stories that are anonymous. So even from square one, we can't even show that the guy was crucified. Okay, I mean, but let's take it as a given that he was crucified. How are these 500 people going to know who he was? Did he really have that many people that could recognize him on sight? Because they didn't have any ID cards. Or did somebody just stand up in front of a crowd and say, hey, look, everybody, this is Jesus, and he was just recently resurrected from the dead. How did they know that that was him? Or did they? Actually, maybe one can say, look, if you just write in some little letter here to the Corinthians that some guy appeared to 500 people, who's going to know the difference, right? I mean, it's if I were to write to you and say, well, a couple of years ago, Elvis appeared to 500 people.
Back then,
After
it would have been
step.
irrefutable.
Right, and then I just send that to you. Hey, look, we have 500 witnesses. Well, actually, you don't have any witnesses if we don't know their names and we don't know any further details. All you have is one person who's claiming to have 500 witnesses. That's not the same thing as having 500 witnesses. Otherwise, nobody would ever get convicted of murder because someone could just say, hey, I have 500 witnesses that say they saw I was at somewhere else when this murder happened. Oh, darn. I guess we don't have to bring in the 500. We'll just take your word for it.
Yeah, I just have to wonder why people put so much stock in this book that is so old and doesn't have any historical verifiability from outside sources. I mean, to them it's irrefutable, but if you look at the history of it, it's riddled with holes and there's no eyewitnesses.
Part of that, from my discussions with some Southern Baptists I know, is because it's so old and it's lasted so long, that's all the evidence that anyone should need, that it is the truth. Now, I have to ask them the same question, would that not apply to the Quran? They go,
Truth
no,
by age.
that one is not true. The Bible is the truth.
Well, they might say that the Quran isn't quite as old as the Bible. But then again, the Rig Veda from Hinduism is older. So
We know that Hinduism is a lie because they have elephants or something like that, and that can't be the truth.
yeah, as opposed to talking snakes like you find in the Bible.
Should we believe in the god Horus, who resurrected in Egyptian time, like 4,000 years before Jesus Christ, as well?
I think that's supposed to be Satan.
God
Yeah.
Horus, the Egyptian god?
Yeah, Satan works through all other gods.
Oh, okay.
The first commandment, have no other gods before me, so.
Well, in fact, some of the early church fathers said exactly that the reason there were these prior resurrections in history, is that Satan did that so that people might be less, believing about Jesus' resurrection.
Now, given the creation myths and the other myths in the first half of the Bible, why would God not feel it fit to include? All right, he's already included the story and the birth or the coming of power, however it would be, of Lucifer falling. Why would he not include that all this other stuff Lucifer has done? These are things that he's tried to do in the past. Why would Horus not be in there? Why would God not put that in the Bible as an example of the things Lucifer would try to blindside us with?
Oversight.
Another thing is,
God doesn't make mistakes.
supposedly this was written in as a fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament. And I have heard, maybe you know more about this or have this in here, that it's thought that the writers of the New Testament wrote in the story of the resurrection in order to fulfill the prophecy. So it's possible that Jesus lived, he didn't do all those things, but they rewrote the story so that it would fit into the prophecies of the Messiah.
Well, yeah, sort of. What they did, and especially Matthew was really big on this, is not only would they write in things so that they could say they're fulfilling, previous alleged prophecies, but sometimes there are even mentions of Jesus fulfilling prophecies that no one can find. Things like that, like saying that Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days so that he could fulfill a prophecy. Okay, well, there is no 3 days and 3 nights. There is no 3 day and 3 night prophecy in the Old Testament at all.
That we know of.
That we know. Well, I mean, we have the thing, right? Or at least the current version of it. So yeah, there's a number of things like that. Also, to say, well, here Jesus predicted his own resurrection. Like Matthew 12:40, Mark 8:31, Jesus is telling people that he's going to rise after 3 days. Well, of course, all of that stuff was written long after the time these events occurred. So it's just as easy to have him predicting his resurrection as it is to write down the resurrection itself, because both of those are post facto.
It just seems to be so hard to know what's true and what's not true, and it's just baffling to me how people take it as absolute truth when, to me, it's pretty uncertain since it happened so long ago.
And sometimes people will say, well, people back then tried to discredit the resurrection. They tried to say that the body was stolen or something. But there's no evidence that there were any contemporary accounts that tried to discredit it. Mostly because probably nobody heard, except for maybe a few select people, if the story of the resurrection was even around in early Christianity. Nobody heard about that except for the Christians. So nobody was concerned to try to disprove it. That's sort of importing a great deal more importance to Christianity in its early days than it probably really had. Same with the empty tomb. Well, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, sometimes people say, why didn't they just whip out the body and say, see, he didn't rise, right? Well, there's probably a couple of good reasons for that. First, it may not be that Jesus was in a tomb at all, because the earliest account we have in the New Testament from Paul doesn't mention anything about an empty tomb or a tomb at all. It just says that Jesus rose, but there's actually some good evidence that Paul may have been a Gnostic, so maybe he understood the notion of resurrection to be much different than everyone else did later, especially since in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, you die with one body, but you're resurrected with another one, a different one, an indestructible one.
Wow.
In other words, one that wouldn't have holes in it, okay? So for Paul, the notion that somebody could go up to Jesus and put their fingers in his holes, or whatever, to prove that this was the same guy, Paul would have thought that's absurd, right? You're not going to get resurrected in the same body. What if you die in a train wreck? You're going to come back for eternity looking like a train wreck, right? For Paul, that would just be absurd. So St. Paul would have said, no, there's no tomb or anything like that. Forget about that body. He's going to get a new one, right? So
we have a couple minutes before I want to go to our on-location shoot. Is there any other points you wanted to cover first?
Well, let me just say one more thing about typically what some people say about the resurrection, that it sounds too real to be mythical. That is, there's no elements of myth because it sounds sort of like a news report and so on. But there are many other stories from the same time, contemporary times, in Greek writings and other places, many of which predate the Gospels, that are also very realistic accounts and so forth. So yeah, that doesn't hold any water whatsoever. Plus, you can see from the earliest Gospel, Mark, over to a later Gospel of John, you can see a progression as if a myth is building. That at first, when people go to the tomb, there's like one guy there and says, "Hey, nobody's here." Then later it's two guys, then later it's angels, and then
right.
it's one angel
and
two angels.
Bigger as time goes on.
Right, exactly, and that's certainly the type of thing we expect to see in a myth.
Right.
But for many Christians, this whole thing is very puzzling because they think, well, why is it that not everybody's a Christian? I mean, you can just go up to them and tell them about the resurrection, and there's knockdown proof, and then there's something nobody can deny. How can anybody not believe in the resurrection? Well, the reason is that they haven't really studied the matter, and it's nowhere near as clear as they would like to present it.
Right. So, folks, read the history of your Bible. And on that note, I want to cut to our on-location shoot at the anthropology lab. So, here we go. You can cut it now.
Okay, recorder's off.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to do the voicemail and then letters from Billy Graham. Okay. Can you do another countdown?
Yes. Yeah, he's gotta get it. He's getting it straightened out.
That was very tight.
Yeah, got our first started.
Huh?
Yeah, that's actually
First
now that
what?
you pointed out.
When we started, the first.
Oh, yeah.
You can bring a pen next time.
Yeah, I was thinking that too.
So I can write down my thoughts as we're talking. Smart.
Ian's prepared.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the only thing I brought, though.
Let's make a mental.